situations of we did the best we could at the time, and initiatives are imperfect, and I think we've made a lot of successes with 940. One of the interesting things about 940 is it required involvement of community stakeholders and rulemaking with at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and I think that that was a significant piece that I didn't anticipate when we were working on it, how important it was going to be to have a place at the table and a voice and to build that voice. And so that's been remarkable. I want to say that before 940 passed, we had what was known as an outlier, one of the worst laws in the nation. The prosecutors call it a de facto immunity. Terry is of the strong opinion that they just don't have the courage to charge under the old law, and that they could have established malice, and that the John T. Williams murder should have been charged. So we actually are still thinking about those pre-940 cases and how important they are. The Department of Justice is still working on the consent decree. Big news there is that the monitor resigned, and there's a new monitor and a deputy monitor who's Monisha Harrell. Many of you know, the board chair of Equal Rights Washington. She works on our coalition with us, this new coalition we've recast, and she's also on the governor's task force with Terry. So the Department of Justice was in Seattle, it was in Spokane, it was in Pasco. We, working on the 940 issues, we heard a lot from police that said, we aren't Baltimore, we're not Chicago, we're not Minneapolis. I said, no, we're not. We have our own problems. They're really similar to problems elsewhere because the history of race and policing is the same everywhere. And but it was something we heard frequently from police unions, is that Seattle doesn't need this kind of thing. We've got it taken care of, and we learned it's not so. So I'm going to turn it over to Terry for her piece on implementation. Thank you. I'm going to go on mute for 5 minutes here.
I should unmute too, so I just did. It really is a pleasure and an honor to speak with everyone. I've been working with Leslie Cushman since around 2016. I was telling Heather and Alyssa, and we've come a mighty long ways from those initial days. And after I-940 was the rulemaking implementation, and Leslie, along with myself, then I was with the NAACP Seattle King County and a number of other community activists as well as community groups worked to implement the rules for I-940 with respect to the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code. And we worked on rules surrounding police officer training, the first aid response, mental health, and as Leslie said, the independent investigations. We learned a lot from the rulemaking session. We worked from January to approximately December of 2019, crafting rules. I have to say the CJTC and WACHOPS and FOP and some of the other law enforcement jurisdictions worked with us, working to craft the best rules. And it may seem like we got one or two good things out of there, but the whole entire process was a great conversation, and it led to the work that we are doing now. The biggest things we did with the rulemaking committee were getting community representatives on the independent investigation teams now. So we worked to separate the investigations, the criminal investigations of the police officer use of deadly force, homicides, from the involved agency, and set up a system where we were able to have other law enforcement agencies than the one that were involved be the investigating team. And on that team, we were able to work in language that allowed for 2 community representatives to be there. They are good placeholders right now. We're working now to get more power to those community representatives. But there have been a number of advertisements for them in Tacoma, I think Spokane, Renton, and I think Des Moines. So far, so good on getting those 2 individuals in place. Right now, the involved agency being the agency where the officer has used force, that individual, their primary duty has been limited according to our rulemaking to just securing that scene and making sure that we have the involved agency not a part and not getting information, not passing information with respect to the actual shooting and the investigating agency. Also really important, the family liaison, where we have information going to the victim's family, the victim of the homicide, their family, making sure that information is getting to them in a timely manner and that that information is thorough, making sure that there is someone there that the family is able to reach out to on a regular basis, and the communication. Making sure that the right information is getting to that family. Let's see, the conflict of interest assessment, we've talked about that, Leslie, and the community was to have quite a bit of input on the conflict of interest. That is where those individual officers, law enforcement officers right now who are going to be doing the investigation of the homicide, along with those 2 community reps, there has to be some sort of a tool to make sure that there is no conflict of interest between those members on the team and the department or agency or officer that's involved in the shooting. But I believe that is ongoing, Leslie, and I'll let you testify to that. I believe the conflict of interest assessment just came out yesterday at the CJTC meeting.
You want me to talk about that right now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll spend 1 minute on this independent investigation issue. And one of the things that we learned during the process, and Heather as a criminal defense person and Terry as criminal defense, this was a huge shift for law enforcement. They've been doing all of the homicide investigations of police use of force internally. And Stanford and Harvard both did studies on how half-hearted their approaches were nationally. It's just, you can imagine how it's difficult to be unbiased when you're investigating yourself and your officers. And they weren't using criminal investigation forms. Terry and I'll talk about that when I talk about monitoring. So they did a half-hearted job. So we were really interested in providing input to the Criminal Justice Training Commission that added transparency, credibility, accountability, and the conflict of interest assessment is where we tried to identify relationships and supervisory relationships, personal relationships, and maybe being on SWAT teams together, that it would interfere with the ability to be impartial. And this was adopted yesterday by the Criminal Justice Training Commission. All law enforcement agencies are required to use it. And one of the things we learned in drafting the initiative, if we didn't stage the timing of everything correctly in the initiative, the law went into effect on December 6, 2018. independent investigations were required at that point, but there weren't any criteria. So this is a lag time that has frustrated some of the investigations. All right, mute.
And so those are the issues that we have taken up with regard to rulemaking. Leslie, you were going to talk about the monitoring work of it. Do you want me to talk about Mr. Chief Stick now, or do you want to talk about the monitoring of 940?
Let me talk about monitoring, and I'm going to mention communication protocols from independent investigations. So RCW 10-114-011, it was very general. It said if there was a death, serious bodily harm or great bodily harm, there had to be an independent investigation. And by working with Terry, we all learned how important it was that it had to be criminal. And criminal means forensic, and has to be result in a product that can be used by the prosecutor for charges. And communication protocols, you all heard about character assassination. So what we addressed in the communication protocols is the police, the involved agency. So when Seattle shoots somebody, they cannot do a press release that says this nasty human being was just shot by our beautiful police officer. So you shouldn't be seeing that anymore from SPD or any other police agencies. The investigatory agency, which is outsourced to a neighboring agency, is in charge of all the communication protocols. They can't do character assassination, and they have to do a weekly communication protocol briefing to the public to keep people informed. So we were looking at transparency there and respect for the family and respect for the public of the gravity of what happened. So after these rules were adopted, and probably during some of it, I know we worked with the City of Tacoma. We had learned, so we worked closely with City of Tacoma, Pierce County, Kitsap County. We exchanged letters with Spokane, Grant County, talked with Moses Lake Police Chief. We were following all of the deaths in the state in 2019, and watching to see whether there was independent protocols being used and whether people were paying attention to conflicts. And we learned that the Tacoma Police Department was still doing their own investigations. So we met with the mayor a number of times. Katrina Johnson, Monisha Harrell, myself, Tim Rainin met. Terry and I and Tim Rainin had meetings with a Pierce County prosecutor. Nina Martinez and I got on the phone with Grant County Sheriff and with the Moses Lake Police Chief. So when things came up like little brush fires, we addressed them. We had sort of a template of a letter we sent to police agencies telling them the expectations. Lakewood was a big effort after the killing of Saeed Joaquin. When that was not handled properly. And so we did some work on that, and we've learned a lot about the gaps. But Terry, if you talk about Stonechild Chief Stick now, and you've got 5 minutes, this is such an important piece of work, the things that we learned from this, and what we hope is going to happen with our legislation with this. And if you don't mention it, I'll try to catch up.
Catch me back up again. Trishenda Pickup is a loved one of Stonechild Chief Stick, who was shot and killed by Officer Keller of the Paulsbo Police Department in 2019 for July the 4th. Did I get that right, Leslie?
So it was the July 3rd fireworks.
In Paulsbo, thank you. And all day there had been reports that Mr. Stonechild Chief Stick had been out and about. He had had at least one encounter with a police officer earlier in the day, where that police officer thought that maybe something might be a little bit off. Several hours later, Mr. Stonechild Chiefstick was at the fireworks display at the park, and there were reports that were coming in that Mr. Stonechild Chiefstick was acting erratically. There were some reports that he was behaving in a threatening manner. There were a couple of reports that had him with a screwdriver. Finally, the police department arrived, and Officer Keller amongst them. And immediately upon the arrival of Officer Keller, he engaged Mr. Stonechild Chiefstick, whereupon he believed that Mr. Chiefstick was threatening him with a screwdriver, had received reports that he had been threatening other individuals with a screwdriver. And if that had been the case, these would have been felony threats, felony assaults. Nonetheless, Mr. Chiefstick was engaged by Officer Keller, and he was shot and killed fairly immediately. Again, there had been reports earlier in the day that Mr. Chiefstick seemed to be a little bit off. There was some questions whether or not there were some substances or mental illness going on with him. And this information was known to the police officers. But nonetheless, there was really no assessment when Officer Keller engaged Mr. Chiefstick. There were 4 police officers there. At least one other of the police officers would not have used a firearm on this victim. And so that was questionable. Leslie and I met with, after the investigation was completed by the KCERT team, that's the Kitsap Critical Incident Response Team. After that investigation was complete and passed off to the Kitsap County Prosecutor's Office, Leslie and I, along with Mr. Chiefstick's loved one, Ms. Pickup, and someone from, I'm sorry, Leslie, the name of that organization?
It was a Surge, Kitsap County Surge, and then Tim Rain and Marilyn Covarrubias.
We all met with the Kitsap County prosecutor, and we discussed the case. We were concerned about whether or not it was necessary to use the force that was used, especially because, again, immediately upon arriving and encountering Mr. Chiefstick, Officer Keller went to him, engaged him, and shot him. And the very serious question of, was this level of force necessary? Were there any attempts at de-escalating the scene? Were there any other, was it necessary to use that level of force? These were some of the questions that greatly concerned our coalition when we went to speak with Prosecutor Enright in Kitsap County. Since we have spoken with Prosecutor Enright, he decided to file charges. He decided not to file charges. I said that wrong. He decided that no charges would be filed because Mr. Chiefstick was engaged in a felony, he believed, with the screwdriver and the threat upon the other individuals in the park, and that Officer Keller had a right to be concerned about that screwdriver. So he had a reason to stop him, probable cause that a felony had been committed or was going to be committed, and that he acted in good faith and decided not to file any criminal charges against Officer Keller. Since that investigation has happened, we continue to research and investigate the facts and circumstances of that case. We will meet again with Prosecutor Enright in the coming days even, so that we can discuss the further information that has come down the pike. If you want to talk about some of the new information, Leslie, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'd like everyone, if they could Google this podcast, the Stone Child Chiefs Kiss. There's podcasts, there's 6 or 7 episodes that are done by Dom Capese, a journalist, citizen journalist, community journalist. They're fantastic. But I guess I should talk about the difference between this case and King County's charging and what we've learned. So I'm going to spend 2 minutes on that. Then I'm going to talk about the work of the coalition, because I know we're getting close to our time here, but I think we're on time and we're doing great. So what Terry is talking about is, was the force necessary? And that's a requirement in state law. 940 made an emphasis on necessary, and does that the force has to be proportional, and the officer has to consider reasonable alternatives to force. But when we talked to Enright, Chad Enright, Prosecutor Enright, he said the analysis is the moment that force is used. And we said that just doesn't make any sense, because the sequence of have you considered alternatives is really important. And one of the officers at the scene said he would have used his taser, and another one said he wouldn't have used deadly force. So there's this notion called reasonable officer. And in the year before, Jesse Saray was killed in Auburn. And just this August, King County Prosecutor Satterberg filed second-degree murder charges and second-degree assault charges. Is that right?
First-degree assault.
First-degree assault, second-degree murder charges against Officer Jeff Nelson. Jeff Nelson has a history of excessive force. I think he's killed 2 other people. And the thing about Keller, in Paulsbo, 25% of all the excessive uses of force cases are attributed to Officer Keller, the person who killed Chief Stick. So one of the things we're looking at, and I'm going to talk about, is decertification and misconduct. And misconduct is abuse of power. It sounds like a little thing, but it's abuse of power, and you can even call it corruption if there's enough misconduct. Falsifying a report, that sounds like corruption. Excessive use of force, targeting Black and brown people, that's not just simple bad faith. So what we learned in the filing from King County Prosecutor is they looked at the sequence, and different than Chad Enright did. And they looked at the notion of a reasonable officer. And they said that the officer in the Auburn case, I won't tell you the details, you can look it up, created the situation by escalating it and created the need for force, and that it wasn't reasonable and it wasn't necessary. So we are going to talk about that with Prosecutor Enright next Tuesday. There's a difference though, the screwdriver's different perhaps, but if you listen to all these podcasts are fun to listen to. It's a great podcast, really well done. It has entertainment value as well as educational value. It's just really good. So you'll learn about those things in the law. I want to go on to tell you, so that's the thing about Jeff Nelson. That's the first charge ever done under 940. So we were wondering when it was going to happen, and I don't say we were losing faith, but we were like, what's going on here? And one of the things that's going on is that prosecutors have a lot of discretion, and they're closely tied to relationships with local law enforcement. So we're working on, so with the death of George Floyd, and I don't know who on this call is aware of the death of Manuel Ellis in Tacoma, but it was a terrible tragedy in March. He was asphyxiated, and there was a cover-up. The Tacoma police did not do a good job of investigating, and they said there was no problem. They actually, they followed the law and gave the required the investigation to be done by Pierce County, who did a very poor job, didn't interview witnesses. The family themselves discovered surveillance video, Ring doorbell video, cell phone video, and it's terrible. And that's why the governor created this task force that Terry is on, to look at independent investigations. So one of our premises as we work through this implementation phase is that it's really hard to tease police out of these investigations and to get an investigation that's impartial and fair and unbiased. And we're working, so we pivoted from 940 and pivoted from our de-escalation campaign, and we've created a loose-knit coalition that has about 10 families in it and about 25 organizations, Latino Civic Alliance, Equal Rights Washington, SEIU 1199.
Disability Rights Washington,
Yep.
ACLU.
Yeah, but lots of people, and I apologize that I'm not going to be able to tell you who they are. I can put a list on the De-Escalate Washington page so people look at that. We're still using the old Facebook page just to share information, but the campaign doesn't exist anymore. We're not a legal entity. We're just a coalition working together. So what we're working on is independent investigations. We're working on deadly force and deadly tactics. We're working on collective bargaining and oversight issues. And the independent investigations, we're trying to, we're working with legislative leadership. They're talking to our coalition weekly. They're waiting for our drafts. We're working in collaboration with them. We have sponsors lined up, and we've been working with House Speaker Lori Jenkins. She's interested in our work, and we think it's going to be well received. We're working hard on it. The deadly force is going to be, we're flipping the script. There's a presumption that use of force is not reasonable, and it has to be, if the Supreme Court cases say there has to be an imminent threat and of serious deadly harm, and we're going to focus on that. Right now, there can be, one of the tragedies we see are shooting, fleeing suspects. Sean Fuhr was killed in Seattle holding his infant. I don't believe he was armed. And he was killed, and it was not necessary. I don't see that it's justified, but I doubt they're going to bring charges. So one of the things we're going to put into our legislation is that all post 940 deaths should be reinvestigated, because we don't think they've been done with an eye for whether it's under current law. Was it necessary? Was there a threat? So we have those issues. We're looking at deadly tactics, chokeholds, police dogs, militarization. Legislators want to work on no-knock warrants. They want to work on qualified immunity, which is the civil side. They want to work on felony bar, and we're putting together teams to work on those issues with them. Let's see. Terry, is there anything else about deadly force?
Vehicle
Go ahead.
The vehicle pursuits.
That's right, hot pursuits. I don't know if you remember when Giovanni Joseph McDade was killed in 2017. It was a pit stop where, he's a kid. A lot of the people killed. And so when we were gathering signatures in 2017, 42 people were killed, and lots of them were youth and community college students. And we are still addressing those scenarios. We learned so much from those scenarios. The Tommy Lay death, the death of Machance Gumnut Gittens. So we are, we're in contact with Amnesty International and lawyers at ACLU who specialize in the deadly force work. They're looking at our drafts to see how they meet international human rights standards instead of police union standards. So we're taking a big step forward and really grappling with police use of force. And Terry, can you talk about the governor's task force? And then we can do questions.
That we are working on. there are probably about 7 or 8 of us from the coalition that Leslie and I are involved in who are on the governor's task force. The hope is at the end of that task force to come away with recommendations for the governor to have a process of independent investigations. And we are working, many of us on the task force are working really hard to make race a central part of that discussion so that the individuals who make up those members of the independent investigation team will have some checks and balances for racial bias. The governor's task force, we expect that there will be recommendations and that the governor's office will put forth legislation. From there, the coalition continues to work on its legislation with its legislative sponsors and et cetera. We're about 5 meetings into the task force, and it is every other Thursday. I believe the next meeting is on the next Thursday. I think it is the 16th. If I haven't gotten that date right, just check the governor's web page so that you're able to see the actual times of that task force, so that you can weigh in, and any questions that you might have, you will be able to put those forth. I was also going to say that Prosecutor Enright has written a letter to the Attorney General. Leslie, yes? So that he's asking for independent investigations.
Yes, but he's made the point that it's politically, it is, the relationships at the local level are too close. Too many inherent conflicts that, and he's recommending independent investigations be done by the Attorney General. We are recommending a standalone agency to do the investigations. So we, meaning our coalition, and recommending that the AG be a special prosecutor. So there's going to be a special prosecutor. Right now, we're gravitating towards the Attorney Generals, since one thing we're very cognizant of is the defunding abolition. We don't want to create a huge investment in new structures. So where there's existing structures, we'd like to use those. We don't intend to create something that we're fond of the reallocating and rebudgeting conversations that are going on.
That's right.
The issue about race was a huge part of the implementation of 940, and it's a huge part of the governor's task force. If you so the origin of modern policing is slave patrols. And we haven't seen any evidence, and maybe police can tell us, that they have made a concerted effort to face that, challenge it, and say, okay, we know that it's true. How are we gonna face our past and change, and because we think that it's an there's inherent racism in the institution of policing, in the practices. One of the things that bothers us by any of this new reform work is to perpetuate it. So when we're looking at the investigation issue, how do you make sure that the investigator's own bias is not going to contribute to unfair outcomes? Let's see, should we look at some of these questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
So let's see, we have a bunch of questions that have come in. So the top of the list is whether you have any comments about how force has been applied to protesters recently and whether that's informing your work at all right now.
RCW 9A16040 actually has this crazy section that says you can use deadly force if there's a weapon displayed in a riot. And we're going to strike that out. There's no reason that use of force in a public setting like that should have a special loophole for broad scale use against a crowd. In general, so I'm from Olympia, and I've been addicted to watching all the live streams. And I've been up to Seattle many times. I go to protests in Tacoma and in Olympia. And I've been, I think they've gone over the line in their use of force. And so that's why we're addressing demilitarization in our deadly tactics. We think that that is a signal and messaging, and it brings a certain behavior with police. Terry?
Some of the behavior of the police departments in Seattle, and I've also watched nationally, I think that it is a good marker, a good indication of how certain parts of society are treated when police are using a particular approach, and that approach is not the same for other parts of society. For instance, there have been a number of instances across the country where people who are not Black have committed some atrocious crime or behavior, and they are taken into custody without too much fuss. But for Black folks and brown folks, meeting that same type of approach is generally non-existent, and it goes to the actual subject. Most of these protests are Black Lives Matter and in response to George Floyd. So I think it's a good indication that police are and agencies and cities are not paying as much attention to the dialogue and what the people who are protesting and uprising about. They are more concerned with shutting down the content, policing the tone of the content. And Leslie is involved and knows some about the case in Lacey, Washington, where a white man who was security for protesters was shot and killed because he had been accused of killing a Trump supporter in Portland. And again, my understanding from reading the latest press releases are that this person was shot and killed on site, wasn't given an opportunity. So it seems like it's an indication, the way that they are approaching, the way that cities and police departments are approaching these protests and uprising, it's an indication of how they are approaching the entire issue of race and Black Lives Matter altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's just so on the front lines. Leslie, I would love to know your favorite live streams. Who do you follow?
I watch them all. I watch, Converge Media, and I watch Rebellion Baby, and I watch Joey Weiser, and let's see. There was Concrete Reporting, but I think they've left. Then there's I frequently look to see what's going on in Louisville, Kentucky for Breonna Taylor. And I watch the Portland things. Yeah.
I
don't get enough sleep.
It's not like you sleep at all.
There we go.
So we have another question about collective bargaining and the role of police unions in sort of creating some roadblocks to reform. I'm wondering if there's variation in that throughout the state, sort of like how the prosecutor's office, some of them are coming into line, some of them aren't, or if it's kind of more uniformly opposed across the state. How do you guys see that?
I can quickly address some of this, and this is legislation that we are just formulating, and we're lucky to have some the folks from SEIU 1199 who are union experts working with us. I will say that when George Floyd was killed and then Manuel Ellis investigation came to the forefront, that the local unions and the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs all took positions on some of these things that were reform oriented. I don't think that WACOPS did, but FOP did. And I know that the SPOG did not. But the issue here is to separate out conditions of work from discipline, and to tease those apart from contracting. The unions, we have not sat down with them as stakeholders yet. And I'm going to go on to this next question, which is who is the main sponsor of the legislation? We do need to work with our sponsors. We're working closely with the members of Color Caucus and the Black Members Caucus. We took our coalition has many Black, Indigenous, people of color on it as in leadership, and the families. One of our values is this is extraordinary work, and it should be housed and led by the members of Color Caucus. So we're working with the leadership, the regular leadership in the House and Senate. So Senator Jamie Peterson, but Manka Dhingra and Senator Saldana and Senator Nguyen, those people, Senator Emily Randall, there's a number of members of color. There's going to be a lot more Black members of the caucus elected after November. The races have been exciting. So we're going to have a different caucus after the election. In the House, we are, of course, in regular contact with Roger Goodman, who's the chair of House Public Safety. But we have great relationships with Representative Jesse Johnson, Representative Deborah Entenman, Representative John Lovick, Representative Bill Ramos. I don't have a list in front of me, and I apologize for not naming everyone, but there's a big caucus and we are in touch with them regularly. So I think it's really important. So the main sponsor issue, we do know who wants to sponsor these, but we are still taking our product and sitting down and talking to them. So the community has a huge role in this. We need sponsors, but they need community. So legislation is fascinating. Okay, go ahead, Heather.
Terry, did you want to chime in on any of those questions before I move on?
The only thing that I would say is with respect to collective bargaining and unions is that pieces of the work that we're looking at are making sure that our state law is shored up and that these collective bargaining agreements do not somehow or another supersede our state law, and making sure that our state law is beefed up so that it is looking out for the interests of the community as opposed to officers.
So I did, one thing we forgot to talk about was decertification. And I know it's big, huge newspaper articles on decertification. We're working closely on that. I know that Senator Jamie Peterson's working on something. We're reviewing his draft, and I think the community lens is much different. And we have lots to say, and we're gonna have lots of feedback for him.
Leslie, can I just interrupt you and ask you to give a brief definition of the term decertification?
So it's interesting in this, so it's like licensure. So decertification would be taking away an officer's certification. And in this state, the Criminal Justice Training Commission is in charge of certifying. And we have one of the weakest states in the nation, processes in the nation. We're working with Professor Goldman, who is a professor from St. Louis, who has made it his life's mission to improve certification and licensure laws. And we're happy that, and we have wonderful experts on our coalition. We have a wealth of genius, and so decertification is the same as licensure. They're synonymous. We need to make sure that it's that officers who have misconduct can't go to other jurisdictions. So and that they lose their license for life. And then where's the line? And what is the behavior? Police officers have a lot of public trust, right? So it's interesting how many misconduct write-ups they might have for character flaws, like lying or taking evidence or planting evidence. Those things are not seen as serious as the community thinks they should be. So we're gonna raise their profile a little bit.
Got it. Okay. I think that you have managed to cover a few of our other questions in your answer. So a lot of overlap too. Wondering here if you have, I think this will probably have to be our last question. For folks who are looking to get more involved in your work and support your work, who maybe can't get out on the streets but want to help from home, what are some steps that you would suggest?
So we're going to have some actual legislative proposals pretty soon, and I'll share them with you, Heather, and the sponsors. And I think we need everybody's local legislators to support these things. We need, one of the strengths of this coalition, and one of the strengths from 940, is that we all stuck together. And we have that same approach on this, because the community, we don't have, we need leverage. We need leverage to get this done. This work is going to take, legislators are going to have to keep their courage and not be afraid of the unions, not be afraid of some costs, and not be afraid of change. And so we are going to need a lot of help from the public. So I commit to keeping Heather informed of what we're doing and who sponsors are, and then we need co-sponsors. So there's might be a special session after the election, and it's going to be a special session looking at the supplemental budget, but they're also going to do some police reform work. So things are going to be moving pretty quickly in the next month, and so I'm going to be in more regular contact with Heather.
Great, thank you so much. I so look forward to chatting with you guys more and following an Observer Corps, following along with the governor's task force. And we just deeply appreciate your time tonight. I know you're both on deadline and super busy, so thank you so much for being here.